I never know if this is officially day 2 of CRWUA, but now that Wednesday's become such a part of the curriculum, let's call this day 2 of CRWUA. You all look great. There are plenty of seats up front. Come on up. But we welcome you. We welcome everybody here. So, listening to the last panel, which was fascinating, and appreciated all the perspectives of our governor's representatives who are representing us on the post-2026 process. I heard something from Brandon Gebhardt from Wyoming, and he said, our job here at CRWUA is to create a deeper understanding of each other's perspectives. And I think that's what this panel is about. We hear from each other a lot in the Colorado River Basin. At CRWUA, this is our one time a year. There's 1,700 of us, they tell us, brought together. But we are so many different perspectives. And we bring together our perspective of being an advocate, of caring about our communities, of who we are paid for and work for. But we also have raised our families in this basin. We recreate, we hike, we backpack, we raft. We're going to hear about that today. This is where we live. This is what we care about. We have a respect for the food that comes from this land, from the people who came before us in this land, from the culture and heritage, whether you've been here over 1,000 years, whether your family's been here 9 generations, or you just moved west because you thought it would be cool, and you've made your life here. That's who we are. That's what this is about. So we have some different perspectives today, and the idea here is to dig a little deeper. Can we do that in 75 minutes? Well, we're going to do our best. But what I will tell you is we have some presentations today. They all contain a great deal of information, and we can use that information. You can use the links. You can go back to it later. The idea is that you can use the presentations later to dig further into those discussions, and of course, to meet further our panelists. So you will see on the app and in your packets, there's some great biographical information on our presenters here. But let me just really quick give a quick intro for each of them. So first, we have Michael Cohen. He is a senior researcher at the Pacific Institute, a California-based nonprofit that creates and advances solutions to the world's most pressing water challenges. He wrote the Institute's 2011 Municipal Deliveries of Colorado River Basin Water Report and served on the Municipal and Industrial Water Conservation and Reuse Work Group that developed that sector's section in Reclamation's 2015 Moving Forward report. Today, he will summarize M&I water use. Kestrel Kunz, new to our stage, welcome, is the Southern Rockies Protection Director with American Whitewater. Close to my heart. She is based at the headwaters of the Gunnison River in Colorado. American Whitewater works to protect and restore rivers while enhancing opportunities to enjoy them safely. Kestrel feels most at home while floating down rivers, but today she will be talking about all sectors of water-based recreation throughout the Colorado River Basin. George Frisvold is the Bartley Cardin Chair of the Agribusiness Economics and Policy at the University of Arizona. Bear down. He's co-editor of the journal Water Economics and Policy, and he will discuss agricultural water use in the basin. Daryl Vigil is the Water and Tribes Initiative co-director. Ed Gerak is the executive director of the Irrigation and Electrical Districts Association of Arizona. AIDA advocates on water, power, and agricultural issues, with a focus on federal hydropower and Colorado River. And Jennifer Pitt, who we all know so well, is the Colorado River Program Director for the National Audubon Society. She'll be speaking about how natural habitats and wildlife are impacted by water in the Colorado River. So as you can see, each of our panel members brings a unique perspective, an incredible amount of expertise to you here today. And I will say, why don't we get started with Mike here?
There it is. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to try to do justice to a very complicated topic. So let's get started. There will be an M&I panel to dig deeper into these issues immediately after lunch, so I'll just tee up the issues and you can ask them the questions. So I just want to start by acknowledging the danger ahead. This is just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today, provide some of the definitions and really the boundaries, the scope. What are we talking about when we talk about M&I water use? And again, as Brenda mentioned, these PowerPoints will be posted, so I'm going to go just a quick overview of some of the topics here, and there'll be some of the text I'm just going to gloss over, but you can refer back if you're interested. So it's important, I think, to talk about definitions. And there's a variety of different definitions of M&I, as you can see here on the slide. The compact really just talks about municipal in terms of domestic uses. It lumps it in together with a number of other issues there. I'm not going to be talking today about tribal water use. Daryl is going to speak generally about a broad range of tribal interests. But I am going to talk a little about water use in Mexico, or at least M&I water use in Mexico. So let's talk a little bit more about where the water goes. So often when people think about M&I water use, they just think about populations. They think about water is going to serve people in the Colorado River Basin and adjacent areas. But in fact, it's much more than that. As you can see in these two different sector uses, it goes to different places, and part of it's residential or just for domestic uses for people, but a large portion of that water goes to support commercial activities. And really, these cities are the economic drivers, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but just to think a little bit about where all the different, where that water goes and how it's used in these municipal areas. So this image is from the Lincoln Institute. I think it's a great map showing the boundaries of the Colorado River Basin and then the adjacent areas. And you can see, or I hope you can see, there's some orange dots on there. Each orange dot represents 50,000 people. So you can even delve down a little bit to smaller population centers, 10,000 people, but what you can really, the takeaway here is that most of the population served by water from the basin lives outside the basin. So there's only about 12 million people within the basin. An additional 23 million people or so are in adjacent areas, including in Mexico, rely on water from the basin. And I keep talking about water from the basin because it's not just Colorado River water. So we often hear that some 40 million people rely on Colorado River water, but in fact, it's a mix of different uses. And I'm going to get to that population number in a second here. But this is just not picking on Peoria, but just to show here's a city within the basin, and only some fraction of their water is from CAP is actually direct Colorado River water use. Some additional portion is tributary use, and then there's a lot of groundwater use. And some of the groundwater connections may be clear, but some of them are less clear to the main stem water. So let's get back to water use generally. This is the most recent data available to date on water use in the Colorado River Basin. You can see it's circled in red there. It's only through 2010. So Reclamation is refining its numbers. There's my understanding is there's going to be a new report coming out in the next several months, updating some of these numbers. But what the takeaway here is total depletions are on the top, this blue line. And then the red line at the bottom is what's considered M&I water use. And you can see it's increased over time from about 2 million to 2.8 million acre feet, including exports. So that represents something like 18% of total Colorado River use as a percentage of total depletions. Now, if we factor in evaporation and use that proportionally, it's closer to 20%, which is the number we often hear about municipal use for Colorado Basin water. Here's a somewhat more updated number showing M&I use within the upper basin solely, not including exports. And you can see that number's tripled over time, but it's not a very big number, right? The y-axis here is 2 orders of magnitude smaller than it was on the last slide. So we're only going from 35,000 acre feet to about a little over 100,000 acre feet. And I've just thrown in here the livestock and stock pond use just as a baseline. So that number is pretty constant, but we've seen M&I use within the upper basin, and again, not including exports, triple over this 50-year period. So Mexico is important here, and I just threw in a locator map to help you show, or to help you see where some of those cities are in Mexico. And you can again see that some of them are within the basin, San Luis Rio, Colorado, and Mexicali in the basin. And then there's the aqueduct that takes water across the coastal range into the Tecate and Tijuana. And what we've seen is that there's currently about 3.8 million people in Mexico relying on water, and this is main stem water. And we've seen about a 40% population growth in these cities. So an increase of about 800,000 people from the year 2000 to 2020. And if we use that number proportionally, some 240,000 acre feet of Colorado River water going to municipal uses within Mexico. So here's a blog I put together at the start of this year, way back in January, because there were some releases that came out of Metropolitan saying that some 7 million people in Metropolitan do not have access to Colorado River water. So LADWP, for example, doesn't currently have physical access to Colorado River water. So we often hear this number, and the number is repeated over and over, is 40 million people rely on, and often it's just said Colorado River water, although often that really refers to tributary uses and other things. But even the 40 million number is too high. So even accounting for population growth, there's the actual number, and the calculations are in this blog, is much closer to 35 million people, including tributary uses and groundwater uses in Arizona. And there's a number of other questions about some of the numbers that are often referred to in the basin. And the point here is really, it's hard to move forward if we don't get our facts straight. So shifting gears a little bit, this slide is really to show the decoupling. And what you can see on the left side of this graph is that water demand pretty closely followed population growth until at least about 2007, 2008. But then since then, water demand, at least in Phoenix, has more or less stabilized. So there's been this decoupling. And if it weren't for this decoupling, the city of Phoenix, the water demand in Phoenix would be 75,000 acre feet higher. So because of these conservation practices, less water is being used in these cities. And here's a similar graphic from Metropolitan. This is just imported water deliveries from Metropolitan, not all the local uses or local sources. But you see kind of a similar trend there, that there's been this decoupling again. And that's mirrored by water use from the Colorado River aqueduct specifically. You can see that through essentially the QSA, right? That's where the line tails off. Pretty much the aqueduct ran full. And then post-QSA, it's dropped on average by about 25% since then, pretty much mirroring the decline in total water deliveries from Metropolitan in their service district. So there's been this decoupling. Population growth does not mean water demand anymore. But that's a problem, right? Because water agencies need to sell water. And their new task is don't buy water. And that's really the message certainly the Pacific Institute's been pushing for many years now, is we need to conserve water. But that creates real financial challenges for these municipal water districts. So many of these districts, something like 85% of their costs are fixed. And they're relying on a variable revenue stream. So that creates real challenges. So there was an article earlier this year that said that Metropolitan this year is facing a $300 million deficit because they've been successful. Right? This is a weird business model, and that's what I was trying to indicate with this Patagonia ad, that how do you run a business when you're trying to encourage your customers to buy less? So that's one of the challenges going on. But the other part of this is that the municipal and industrial sector or category in the basin and in adjacent areas contributes about, and this is just my rough estimate, $2.4 trillion. Right? That's more than 10% of the total GDP of the country. $2.4 trillion because of water from our basin. So let me leave it there, but the takeaway here, I really want to end with this, how important water is for this municipal sector. And then I just have a slide here at the end showing some of the sources, but I will end with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, and good morning, Colorado River stakeholders. It really is an honor to be here with you all, but there certainly are a whole lot of you, and I'm a little nervous. So I thought that I would imagine that I'm giving this presentation while we are all on a rafting trip together. And while we are on this rafting trip, we're going to learn about the economic impacts of water-related recreation in the basin. We're also going to learn about how drought has affected numerous types of water-related recreation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we have available to inform water management discussions. And I realize that this image is probably not a vision of comfort for everybody here, but I am confident that everyone in this room has at some point enjoyed time outside by the water, whether that's rafting, motorboating, fishing, tubing, or just sitting by the river with your family. All of these activities depend upon the water. And it also turns out that not only does recreation bring people happiness, but it also supports our economy. So according to a US Bureau of Economic Analysis study that came out recently, they found that outdoor recreation has surpassed $1 trillion in economic impact in the US. For the Colorado River Basin, the last basin-wide study that was completed for water-related recreation was over 10 years ago, but even then, it contributed $26 billion. A couple more recent studies showed that water-related recreation contributed $19 billion in Colorado and $13.5 billion in Arizona. And so while in general, increase in recreation popularity is happening, there's a couple specific areas in the Colorado River Basin that have had a little bit of a more rocky history, yes, pun intended. And so this graph on the top shows the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, Lake Mead, and Grand Canyon National Park. And so since 2019, visitation at all three of these areas has actually decreased. This is likely due to both a couple pandemic closures and then also low reservoir levels, which have hindered access. On the other hand, interest in Grand Canyon river trips has increased, which correlates with increase in paddle sports participation across the country. And we've seen an increase in 64% of Grand Canyon permit applications. So if you're actually looking to get on the Grand Canyon and get your own permit, that's actually kind of a bummer. And so not only is outdoor recreation becoming more popular, but it is slowly becoming more diverse. And so here are just a few examples of businesses and organizations that are working to make water-related recreation in the basin more accessible and more diverse. There are still some challenges, including high cost of entry for some activities, and then also indigenous communities sometimes don't have access to the rivers right in their backyard because of permitting systems. And while outdoor recreation in the modern sense is still largely white, indigenous peoples have been traveling down rivers and exploring these waterways before we even really invented the concept of recreation. And so fishing is one of the fastest growing outdoor recreation activities in the country. Between 2021 and 2022, fishing increased by 23%. And unfortunately, this has coincided with a couple very low water years in the basin. And this is maybe most noticeable in our headwater states where cold water trout fisheries are feeling extra stress. Some states, like Colorado, have taken extreme measures by closing rivers that have low water levels and high temperatures. There were over 17 fishing closures that lasted longer than a month just in 2021. On the other hand, some states like Utah have doubled down on angler education and have been able to keep rivers open to the public. Fishing license sales have started to go down this year, but I do think some of these issues will still persist. So in addition to drought impacts in our headwaters, we have also seen some major recreation challenges downstream. This shouldn't be a surprise, especially if you have visited Mead, Powell, or taken a recent trip down Cataract Canyon. I can tell you from personal experience that the takeout for Cataract Canyon has turned into a cliff, and low reservoir levels have left motorized boat ramps literally miles from the water. As of this week, only 4 of 11 public boat ramps at Lake Powell and 4 of 6 boat ramps at Lake Mead are accessible. And so to help address some of these infrastructure challenges, over $200 million in disaster relief funding has been earmarked for Lake Powell and Lake Mead improvements. And so despite some of these challenges with low reservoir levels, trust me, nobody is excited about drought. There are now opportunities to conduct cultural surveys at the exposed reservoir levels, and there are canyons and rapids that are coming back that people haven't seen or explored in over 50 years. So as we continue to see less water in the basin, we can expect that both our managed and unmanaged rivers will change. And when we are planning for the future, recreation typically isn't recognized by Western water law. However, at many of our reservoirs across the basin, there are voluntary water sharing agreements and stakeholder groups that include recreation interests. One example is the Taylor River Users Group, just in my backyard. These dialogues create opportunities to provide flows for recreation while simultaneously meeting downstream water rights. And in order to best inform these conversations, we need to quantify what flows support different recreational experiences. That's why, for decades, American Whitewater, academic researchers, and federal agencies have been studying the relationship between river flows and river recreation experiences. So this map is the geographic Colorado River Basin, and it's just in the US. And all the whitewater reaches are represented in blue, and all of the rivers that we have official recreational flow studies on are in purple. So we have over 4,400 miles of river recreation opportunities throughout the Colorado River Basin. And for over a quarter of these rivers, we have completed river recreational studies characterizing what flows support recreation. So for your reference, at the end of this PowerPoint, I have included links to these studies, and we have also shared this data as part of near and long-term planning efforts for Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And I really just want to emphasize that recreation data is just one piece of a very complicated puzzle, but there is some important data that we can use to inform these discussions. And one thing I actually learned when I was teaching kayaking in my more dirtbag days was that people really only can remember 3 things at once. And so if you're gonna have just 3 takeaways from today, it's that recreation helps support and diversify our economy. Drought has affected many different types of recreation in the basin, and we do have robust data to help inform some of these conversations. So thank you very much for having me.
So do I have to? Okay. Well, good morning. So I'm going to talk about water in the Colorado Basin and agriculture. And I'm going to follow that lesson and stick to 3 points. So point 1, there's a scientific consensus that improving irrigation efficiency does not conserve water. This is what is called a zombie idea, an idea that is repeatedly refuted by peer-reviewed analysis and evidence. It should have died, but it still clings on. There's an excellent survey piece by Perez Blanco and an international group of colleagues that reviewed 230 studies, and they found that the norm, by and large, overwhelmingly, is that improving irrigation efficiency increases water consumption. Why? Improved efficiency, by definition, reduces return flows and groundwater recharge, or both. Now, is there a role for improved efficiency and conservation? Yes, because improved efficiency can lower the costs of institutionally imposed constraints on water supplies and water use. But it's the institutional constraints and limits that get you the conservation. Now, by making it more affordable, irrigation efficiency could make these institutional constraints more politically feasible. But improved efficiency in and of itself does not contribute to conservation. There are rare special cases where it won't lead to increased water consumption, but that is not the norm, even though most people assume that it is. Also, improving irrigation efficiency can have unintended negative consequences for riparian ecosystem, taking away flows and seeps that they require. Point 2, less water-intensive cropping systems in the Colorado Basin have larger footprints. What one often sees in press stories is what I call vilification of what they call water-intensive crops. And these are crops that are defined in terms of how much they use per acre. So how many acre-feet per acre is applied. Water footprint refers to the amount of water needed to produce a certain quantity or certain value of water. So think of how many acre-feet of water do you need to produce $1,000 of a crop? Or you could flip that around and look at economic water productivity. What's the dollar value of crops produced per acre-foot of water consumed? The basin counties with lower water intensity in terms of acre-feet per acre have the highest water footprint, and vice versa. Here's a map. On one side, you have acre-feet per acre, and this is consumptive use of irrigation water. And the other slide is BWF. It's the blue water footprint. It's consumptive use of irrigation water per $1,000 of crop produced. And you can see that the two maps look like negatives of one. One is the negative of the other. So the counties to the south that have the highest acre-feet per acre have the lowest water footprint. In contrast, the counties that have less water-intensive crops in terms of water use per acre have the highest water footprint. So you're using way more water per $1,000 generated. Point 3, I'm gonna look at hobby farms. This is looking at USDA data from the most recent 2018 Irrigation and Water Management Survey from the Census of Agriculture. In the upper and Colorado Basin, farms that have less than $25,000 in gross sales applied more than 0.8 million acre-feet of water. It's hard to get county-level data or basin-level data, but if you look at this class of hobby farms that have less than 25K in sales, if you look at their use across the entire 7 basin states, so for example, this would include parts of California outside the basin, these hobby farms applied 2.3 million acre-feet of water. As a group, this farm had net income losses of $1.2 billion per year across the entirety of the basin states. So these small hobby farms have farm income losses that account for $500 in losses per acre foot. So when we're talking about the cost of getting water and giving it up, there's a significant amount of water that is being used to lose money. These group of hobby farms also account for less than 1% of gross farm income in the region. So if water were diverted from these groups, you wouldn't be losing net farm income, you wouldn't be losing basin-wide agricultural productivity. That's it, thanks.
Good morning, everybody.
Wait.
No, that's fine. He's next.
Oh, sorry.
You're up.
The slides are off.
Do you have any
No,
slides?
it's
Oh, okay, you're the next one, sorry.
yeah. No, thank you, George. I need to be set straight every once in a while, I want to thank Brenda for moderating this panel, and I want to thank CRWUA for the invitation to be able to share what I'm going to present today. And I just, always be forever grateful, to Brenda and her forwarding and the advocacy to get the tribal water study done, which is incredibly meaningful to the 10 Tribes Partnership and really set foundational goals for tribal government relationships and really told each individual tribe's story. And that's why you have the flags behind me in terms of the representation of the 10 Tribes Partnership, because they are the formal member of CRWUA. And in 1992, a tremendous group of tribal leaders who had just settled their water rights, came together. And as my former president, Levi Posada of my tribe, has shared with me, that they crashed a meeting at what used to be McCarran Airport and to demand inclusion. And so that's, they formed the 10 Tribes Partnership because they knew that they were going to have to be concerned for their membership about operations and maintenance and development of their settled water rights. So I'm very proud of the fact that, that I got to help chair the CRWUA conference a few years back. And, it was the first time that we had ever, highlighted, the 30 tribal sovereigns in the basin. Yes, it was the partnership that was hosting it, but, and so those flags are very, very important in terms of the representation and the inclusion of tribes in this conversation, because I can tell you, I haven't missed a CRWUA in 12 years, and I can definitely tell you that this room and kind of the spirit is definitely different. And I'm so grateful, because I think a lot of it has to do with what I'm going to talk about in terms of building new structures. And earlier you saw one of our logos, our WTI logo, that has 30 concentric rings that go together. And, that was to represent, that there are 30 tribal sovereigns in the basin, and they need to make sure that there's the inclusion and the thought, and always to remember that to include all 30 of those tribes. And I think for us at WTI, the Water and Tribes Initiative really was founded in the principles that I first got at 10 Tribes Partnership. And to really see, the magic, when tribal leaders got together and were able to forward something collectively that was of importance to them. And so we want to make sure, in terms of promoting a broader basin conversation, that those elements, and when I think about this panel about foundations, I can't help but think about the fact that it's been proven fact that, indigenous people have been in the Colorado River Basin for 30,000 plus years. There was a created narrative for a long time that we were just recent newcomers to this area. But, we've been here, in terms of what I've learned from my teachings, we've been here forever. We were created here, and this is where we come from. And so those foundations and those principles that I've been working from are those that were instilled in me, by my grandparents in terms of, those spiritual foundations of kindness, love, generosity, tolerance, and inclusion. And those are absolutely principles that, we operate from in terms of what we do at the Water and Tribes Initiative. And our agenda is just twofold. It's to help enhance and build tribal capacity, and so that can look a whole lot of different ways, but really, centered around the conversation about water policy and water development. And the second part of our agenda is, a collaborative problem solving. And we really recognize that there was an incredible desire and wanting of and willingness, to engage in a broader conversation, but maybe the structures that exist, weren't conducive to, really forwarding, the building and forming and forging of relationships. And so had the opportunity, to really, partner with my partner, Dr. Matt McKinney, in terms of how can we be helpful to first the tribes, because that's always going to be where I'm grounded, but the broader basin as well, and the understanding that everything is connected. And in order for us, and the tremendous broader opportunities that we have in a collaborative situation. And so, one of the first things that we did is we went out and did a document, or there's a document called Toward the Sense of the Basin. And that document, reflects over 150 interviews that we did across the basin, and probably a lot of you were part of those initial conversations. And we asked, what is your personal relationship and your professional relationship to the Colorado River? Invariably, we spent the whole time talking about their personal relationship to the river. And that was so moving, because what that told us in our listening is like, wow, we're grounded in the common values of a living, sustainable Colorado River. And wow, what a great foundation to start from. And so, two great foundations in terms of like the spiritual foundation and that was laid here by the 30 tribal sovereigns that have endured and that continue to endure in this basin, and then the willingness and the human willingness to really do something transformational in the basin. And the world is watching what we're doing here, and what we're gonna, how are we gonna manage this next 2 years in terms of really determining, our water future. And there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there. There was lots of tension in that panel before, but those are things that we need to walk through, and I'm very grateful for being able to be helpful in this. And so when we talk about building new structures, this is what's happening in the Upper Basin right now. And it started with a conversation first with the Upper Basin Dialogue, where the Upper Basin tribes and a host of NGOs and the Colorado River Sustainability Campaign started talking about, we seem to have some overlapping agenda. We should talk. And that thing just took off in terms of that conversation built the vision statement, and they've done joint advocacy as well. And that prompted, the Upper Basin Tribal Sovereigns Dialogue, where the tribal sovereigns in the Upper Basin saw the need to start getting together and sharing information. And that produced an incredible result in terms of what we see as a big win in terms of structural inclusion for tribal sovereigns is, formal inclusion in the DROA process. And that was really, really big for tribes. And so what did that do? The conversation then, sparked a conversation with this, with the Upper Basin, what we call the Upper Basin Tribes State Dialogue, which is the tribal conversation with the Upper Colorado River Commission. And that was kind of going along parallel to state-based dialogues, because it's really important to understand that most of the state tribal relationships are either in their infancy or non-existent. And having the need to build those relationships was very critical to this. And so we have, the state of Colorado has entered into MOU with its 2 Ute tribes to ensure that they're going to work collaboratively on the next process. And that's an example. And New Mexico is wanting to do that, something similar as well. And so that spawned, that the UCRC dialogue, and really empowered that conversation. And where are they at right now? They're talking about, as you heard at their meeting, if you were there, about an MOU and a charter that will create as much structural inclusion as allowable by the law right now for tribes to participate. And those things that, probably couldn't have been imagined maybe 10 years ago. And so, excuse me. And so this upper basin conversations then, sparked, the broader basin-wide conversations. And, the 10 Tribes Partnership of the Colorado River, has been such a mainstay and for the longest time, but there were tribes that were interested in, a broader conversation of that was inclusive of the 30 tribal sovereigns. And so 14 tribal leaders themselves formed the Basin Tribal Coalition. It was first called the Tribal Leaders Forum, but they thought it needed to be more distinct, and they changed the name to the Basin Tribal Coalition. That Basin Tribal Coalition has been incredibly active in terms of advocating for tribal water rights on a broader basis. And one of the things that they did is you probably saw the letter to Secretary Holland that 20 tribal sovereigns in the basin signed on to, historic in nature. And that, that there was such an overwhelming desire about, informing, because there was this repetitive, what do tribes want, what do tribes want, what do tribes want? Well, here's what they're telling you what they want now. And that was really powerful that the tribes came together in that way. And so what did that spark? That sparked a conversation with the federal government. And the federal government has started this tribal information exchange, to share what they're doing. And inside of both of those conversations, the Basin Tribal Coalition and the Tribal Information Exchange, for the last almost 2 years, the Basin Tribal Coalition has been meeting with a subgroup of Bureau of Reclamation leadership about, this idea of how do we make sure that all the sovereigns are included in this conversation, because that's been what the tribes had been asking for, structural inclusion, so they could speak on behalf of their own water rights. And so what this is, what these two conversations then sparked was the desire for the federal state tribes group, or the sovereigns, to start meeting. And as of this last Tuesday, that group, the sovereigns group, had its third meeting. And wow, again, historic in nature. And hopefully those are things that are setting the foundation for, structural inclusion in the next set of policy framework. So hold on, just one more slide. So process of building new structures. What is the currency of this problem solving, that we instill in this, that has seemed to be work and be successful in creating and fostering those conversations that you just saw, is respect, trust, communication, understanding, and agreement. The only way, if you know one tribe, you know one tribe. You got to go to them. And if you know one NGO, you got to go to them. The role of spatial scales, to build alliances and to develop solutions at a state and sub-basin level. So people are talking to each other, share information, coordinated actions at a basin-wide scale. And those are things, again, that hadn't happened before. But if we're going to build the next framework and have it be inclusive of voices that haven't been heard before, then absolutely this process is necessary. And it's been my honor to be able to participate in this process. So thank you.
Well, as a former irrigation district manager, I know the importance of power when it comes to moving water. So I was asked today to speak on what's been described as the most complex machine in the world, the U.S. electrical grid. I was hoping to have a few history slides to kind of lay the foundation of how we got from where we started to where we are today, but when I was told I only had 7 minutes to talk, well, those slides became history as well. So early transmission, I'm talking late 1800s, had a distance limitation of about a half a mile. So your generating stations had to be close to the load center, or city center for that matter. As transmission technology improved and advanced, we were able to move to larger scale projects for economies of scale, away from city centers, and the grid grew out to what was available, to utilize what was available and abundant. So that created the foundation of our energy grid, which is base load generation. Unfortunately, thanks to deregulation in the late 90s, a decade of essentially 0 to 1% load growth, early plant retirements, drought, electrification, supply chain issues, permitting issues, and other ancillary issues, we've been chipping away at that strong foundation, creating a reliability concern for all the Western interconnect, and that's what's represented in the lower left-hand side, that symbol. In the West, the base load generation was basically coal and hydropower. 67% of the energy generated in Washington is hydropower, about 50% in Oregon. It's more like 7% in California and 4.5% in Arizona, but it is a huge component of our generation mix that is vitally critical to maintaining the grid, the reliability, the resiliency, integrating renewables. When I got involved in power in 2010, coal was 50% of the generation mix. Today, that's down to 20%. Natural gas has picked up a lion's share of that early retirements, though it's 40%, and hydro has gone from 7% of the load down to 6%. But what most people don't realize is a third of the total energy, not electricity, total energy consumed is out of petroleum. So as we look to electrify everything, we're going to basically have to increase our generation fleet today by 50%. Oh yeah, and there's multiple tech companies wanting to come in and add data centers at 500 to 1,000 megawatts a plot to capture your vacation photos and store them on the cloud, and AI and Bitcoin mining. So there's a lot of locations that these people are researching that don't have excess energy to locate. There's actually a proposed campus in Arizona that is the equivalent, that would draw the equivalent of the Palo Verde nuclear generating station. So that's 2 Hoover dams powering 1 data center campus. Because of seasonality of the weather, resources were built to supply local needs, but there's things called winter and summer peakers. Obviously, Arizona is a summer peaker because of our extreme heat. The Northwest is more of a winter peaker because it gets a little bit cooler up there, colder in the winter. And those regions were able to share excess resources when they didn't need it. In fact, the Colorado River Storage Project allocates winter and summer load based on depending if you're a winter or summer peaker. But due to recent regional heat waves in the West, those excess resources are no longer there. They're needed to, accommodate or compensate for 100-degree weather in Portland and Seattle, where in the summertime that excess energy would typically go to air conditioning load in the Southwest. So when it comes to the West, you cannot decouple water and energy. Energy is used to lift water, move it, clean it. Water is used in the generation of electricity. And as surface of water availability decreases, more people are turning to wells, which is increasing the pumping load on the system. So the consumptive use of residents, they consume more water through indirect use of energy than they do in consumptive use of drinking water. So this is a national average from the American Public Power Association. They estimate it takes 11,857 gallons per megawatt hour to generate electricity. So It's been estimated California uses about 20% of their electricity to move and treat water. Despite the slide or the picture on the right, even solar panels use some water for cleaning. That's about 20 gallons per megawatt hour is the estimate. Now, we're not unique in the West. It's a nationwide issue for industrial water use, but it's exacerbated in the West because of our topography and our temperatures. So, in a nutshell, what I want you to take away from my presentation is that we're in the middle of a power drought. We have not been able to keep up new additions, new plant generation capacity to compensate for new load growth and early retirements. A friend of mine once said that when it comes to the electrical grid, physics trumps philosophy. If you don't have the capacity, you'll end up with blackouts and brownouts. When it comes to the transmission grid, they estimate that they need to triple the amount of transmission in the United States to basically help electrify everything, especially as they move some of these generating sources out to more remote areas. The problem is high voltage transmission lines take over a decade or more to get permitted, constructed, and energized. Transformers, a lot of you guys probably realize this. I'm speaking to the choir. They're over 12 months out in lead time. So if you're hoping for new development, subdivisions, line extensions, there's a lag there. And the Department of Energy wants to change the transformer makeup. They want to make it utilizing amorphous steel. There's one amorphous steel plant in the United States that makes transformers. Obviously, supply chain concerns, we've all experienced that. We touched on the new loads, the data centers and Bitcoin mining. There's a push on Capitol Hill from both sides to reform permitting, but certain people want to just make that expedited permitting for solar and transmission lines. It's not the entire generation suite. And then finally, there's a lot of emerging technology that can help us in the future, but hydrogen's one that can help subsidize or offset some of the natural gas production. But a lot of people are making hydrogen out of water, and we're already in a drought, so that might not work so well in the West. Small modular nuclear reactors, that's a clean energy source, but those are probably still another 10 years out. Batteries, that can help take the glut of solar during the day, store it, and extend that life cycle of solar panels. One thing to know, though, 70% of the rare earth minerals in most batteries come from China. And, there's a lot of tension between our country and China at times, but thank you for this opportunity. Just, it's always good to have people consider power as they're moving water.
Thanks. I'll try to take us home here. I want to talk about how, past development on the Colorado River Basin and the future challenge of climate change, the present and future challenge of climate change are challenging the basin's resilience, what that looks like, and a little bit about what it looks like to address some of these challenges. I'm Jennifer. The intros were a while ago. I work for the National Audubon Society. We protect birds in the places they need, and we figure that if you take care of the birds, you're taking care of most of the environmental problems in the world. I will say that our work in the Colorado River Basin is predicated on the need to take care of people's water issues first. We are well aware that if we haven't taken care of our own needs for water we're not going to find the political will to take care of environmental needs for water. So that's how we work on these issues. Development of the basin over the past century changed where, when, and how much water flows. And clearly, and I'm not telling this as new news to anybody, resulted in a dramatic loss in habitats. In this graphic, we've tried to represent that change in the water flowing in the river. This is actually measured at CRWUA. In blue, and we're also showing the difference between the annual average flow and the peak flow, and that difference has diminished over time. And that's important because it's those peak flows that provide important reproduction opportunities for fish, and also are what keep the forests that grow alongside the river, which are part of the river's ecosystem. Sometimes we call it the riparian forest, keeps that alive. In green, we're showing some milestones and changes to that riparian forest. And in red, just a couple of the endangered species listings that have appeared over time. This is our history, and it happened a long time ago, a lot of it. And I don't really think we could say that anybody in this room was part of most of the decisions to develop the river this way. But that doesn't mean we're off the hook. Our water supply does depend on a healthy watershed, just like 70% of all wildlife in the basin depends on healthy rivers and tributaries. Everyone in this room has the opportunity to support the programs that will improve the resilience of this basin in the future as climate change bears down upon us and extended droughts become more of our normal future. There is no Colorado River Protection Act, but there are programs that are focused on endangered species that also give water users the compliance permits they need to keep diverting water. There are programs that governments have committed to because of the importance of particular resources like the Grand Canyon, like the Colorado River Delta. And there are programs that are tied to transactions, water transactions, and also straight out commitments of public and private funds that can be used to support work on private lands and on tribal reservations. Every Colorado River water user depends on the health and integrity of the basin. Our water supply is vulnerable as climate change and extended drought impact the forested watersheds that produce our water supply. And you can see on the left, and this is beetle kill, but that's very much related to temperature and drought. On the right, you see channel head cuts, and those not only look like a problem for whatever might be living in that creek, but it's also a problem for the soils in the land adjacent to it. And I don't mean just right next to it, but far out. A healthy stream keeps water in the valley bottoms and the wet meadows, and that's filtering our water, and it's also allowing our streams to flow year-round. When you get these channel head cuts, you get a much flashier system. These are challenges with water supply that we do face today, and I think are an opportunity that we haven't invested in yet, but that we can invest in to help us with watershed resilience, and that will help our water supply. Water users, as I mentioned, do depend on the recovery programs for Endangered Species Act compliance. On the left, you see one of the 4 Colorado River native fish, the endangered razorback sucker. And I wanted to point out that 2023 was actually a banner year for the razorbacks, thanks to coordination between the drawer releases and the recovery program. There was management that created conditions allowing the fish to have a really good year for reproduction. So we are figuring out ways to take care of these species. And as Kestrel mentioned, and I'll say environmental priorities also include the dozens of blue ribbon trout fisheries that are incredibly lucrative to nearby communities. And we need to take care of these too. And she mentioned that 2021, there were extensive closures of these fisheries, and we need to figure out how not to have that be a problem for us in the future. Environmental priorities also include the Grand Canyon, and visitors flock to the river there to experience one of this country's crown jewels. Boat trips have long been challenged due to the erosion of beaches because sediments are trapped behind the Glen Canyon Dam upstream. And we have good news here too. In 2023, water that was released under the high flow experiment protocol resulted in a significant expansion of beaches. So again, a place where we see problems, but we're learning how to address them. Environmental priorities also include resources that depend on water flowing off of irrigated farms and ranches. This is a picture of the largest remaining wetland in the Colorado River Delta. It's called the Cienega de Santa Clara, and it depends for its water supply on flows that are coming off of farms in the Yuma area. The Cienega is home to millions of shorebirds that migrate up and down North America, and Mexico has protected it as a federally protected area. So it's going to be important for the US and Mexico to figure out a way to protect the water supply for this wetland. Healthy rivers, as I mentioned, are not just water in the channel, but also the riverside forest. And in the lower basin, because of how we've managed the river, that forest has largely disappeared. And that is a problem for wildlife. Here are just a few of the birds that depend on habitats in the basin, in that riparian forest. What we do in this basin matters for us as people who live here, but it also matters at a continental and global scale. This is referring to a study that was published just a few years ago. Scientists used fascinating method of analysis where they looked at old weather data, radar, and were able to track bird biomass change over time. And they concluded that in North America, we've lost almost 30% of our birds since 1970, 3 billion birds lost. So everything we can do to help protect the wildlife around us is needed to prevent these declines from getting worse. You know, we speak a lot at the Colorado River Water Users Association about the climate crisis, which I think we all feel, but we are also experiencing a biodiversity crisis. And if we want our children and their children to inherit not just the river, but all life that it supports, we have to include that in our thoughts about how to manage this river. And of course, the environment isn't just home to wildlife, it's our home. And if we're not careful, the drying of this basin could give us a future that none of us want, of dust and despair. The good news is that as climate change keeps us in the grip of drought and threatens the resilience of this basin, we already have experience addressing these challenges. We might not be able to stop the drying, but we know that with support for the existing programs and investments in long-term watershed resilience, we can make a difference. What you're seeing here is forest that was recreated along the river in Mexico in the formerly completely desiccated Colorado River Delta. This forest has been put back on the ground by Mexican NGOs working in partnership with the governments of the United States and Mexico under Minute 323. And with these forests, we have seen an increase in bird species and populations. And here you see people connecting with nature and enjoying environmental flows in the Colorado River Delta. And I'll end with this nod to people because it is both for us and up to us to make sure that we have a resilient Colorado River Basin well into the future. Thanks.
Thank you to our many varied interests on this panel. We started by saying that it's our job to, in this room, gain a deeper understanding of each other's perspectives. And I think we've gone a long way towards that with our limited time. But we do have a little bit of time, and I have a couple questions for the panel. And then maybe we might have a minute or two, just if anyone would like to give final comments. But we've talked about so much data and research and analysis. Many of you have pointed to that. It can be overwhelming. In the Colorado River Basin, we talk about modeling. We talk monthly about forecasts and modeling river elevations and what that can look like. But what are we missing inside all of this data and all of this understanding and so many different sectors? Just throwing it out to the panel, whoever would like to answer, like, what data are we missing? What do we need for the answers we're seeking in the next 2 years and 30 years and 50 years?
I guess I'll jump in. So, as I mentioned in this blog I put out at the beginning of the year, there's a lot of basic information we don't have. So there's, on the one hand, this new modeling tool that Reclamation has developed has incredible sophistication. Multiple river scenarios, multiple hydrologic scenarios. So incredible sophistication and complexity in this. This is
by Reclamation.
Sorry?
The new model by Reclamation.
Sorry, the model by Reclamation, which I think they have a booth over there and you can play with it. So there's an incredible complexity and sophistication in this model, but as I was pointing out in my blog, there's a lot of basic information we don't have. So we still don't really know how much water is consumed in the basin. So we have the annual reports, consumptive uses and losses reports, but where that goes by sector, how that water is actually used. So this managing the unmeasured notion I put forward is that some of this basic information we still are struggling to understand. So getting, I think, greater clarity on some of those basics is going to be helpful to us to move forward to understand how much water is going to each sector, where is that water going in each sector, what are the economic values of that water, and we heard from George that in some places it's a money-losing proposition. So how do we bring that all together and then start working from a common basis, common understanding of the facts, so we can help solve the crisis that threatens us all?
I can add a little bit. And I had talked a lot about the recreational data that we do have, and there's certainly a lot of it. But I think one of the barriers is how do we get that information to people? How do we make it more accessible? And so we've had some progress with that. We're developing interactive tools where people can look at this data for certain areas throughout the basin. Two that come to mind are the Green River below Flaming Gorge, and then also my hometown area, the Gunnison River Basin below Blue Mesa. And so that hope is to get that information out to a broader number of people. And I was encouraged. I stopped by the Virga Labs booth yesterday, and recreation is currently not part of that interactive tool, but they are working hard on making that happen. And so that should be available by the end of the year, is what they said.
I think another issue is huge lags in when we have data. So look, the Irrigation Water Management Survey of the Census of Agriculture. The most recent year is 2018. The USGS county level data on water use is from 2015. So with a lot of water issues, we're looking at data in the rearview mirror. It would be really nice to have things that weren't, 5 or 10 years old to look at. So we have some sense of what happened, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But that's, we need to know now.
Yeah, just a couple things. What needs to be included. I mean, I think of Brad Udall and talking at, I think it was Getchus Wilkinson, and talking about science and data and challenging the scientists and the data collectors to stand up for their product. And, and because the science is real, and we're in this for, as he says, 150 years or so. And so to acknowledge that and to acknowledge the reality of the hydrologic situation and that we cannot sustain, the current amount of usage, and that we have to transform in some shape or form. The second thing that absolutely needs to be, recognized again is tribal water rights. And why? Because tribes hold collectively 3.4 million acre-feet of water rights in the Colorado River Basin, 25% plus, and some of the most senior rights. And we also know that what has been happening historically is an inability for tribes to develop those water rights. So we have, for the longest time, the tribal water rights really, saving the basins behind. But, in terms of uncompensated, undeveloped, and unrecognized tribal water rights, I mean, it's pretty substantial. And we need to clear that gray area up, because tribal water rights are distinctly different than state-based water rights. They're of a future reserved nature, and that's the only quantity that tribe has for its tribe forever. And so, we need to inform the broader basin about the distinctions, between those two types of water rights, because it's very important to understand. Because if we don't understand that, we may face a situation where, and without structural inclusion, that there's a reality that those things could be taken away from us, and we're very aware of that. And so this is very critical in terms of the understanding and having the broader basin understand the differences of those water rights. So,
from a hydropower situation, as we plan out on the calendar year, you try to set a rate base. So you're trying to estimate how much energy you're going to get, how much your A&G is and all that, and what it's going to cost you, so you can resell that to the customers. One thing that we found when I was at the Arizona Power Authority is typically the projections were 3-4% greater than what we actually got. So we started building that buffer into our system. We've been asking for a sensitivity analysis tool for years. I'm happy that the post-2026 process has included something to that. But for every acre foot of water that's conserved behind Powell, behind me, that's less generation being generated at those dams. So there's less energy coming to the allottees.
I didn't make this up, but if you can't measure it, you're going to have a hard time managing it. And we don't really measure what's happening in the ecosystem. We do in very limited ways. So first is I would make a plug for more federal support and state support for the monitoring programs that help us understand the changes that are happening over time with our natural heritage. And the second thing I'll say is that while the tribes were the first people using the river was the first river using the river and all the wildlife that depends on it, nonetheless have not much in the way of water rights. And where we even are proactively aiming to manage for restoring habitats or sustaining habitats, we're often not doing a good job of quantifying how much water we're used. If you look in the Reclamation's Lower Colorado River Creek counting reports, I would challenge you to find how much water we're using to sustain the habitats for the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program, not accounted for in there. So I think we need to do a better job of thinking about, measuring for what we want to manage.
Thank you. I think we're out of time. I want to thank everyone for their attention to all these important matters. Some really great perspectives and information shared today. As I mentioned at the beginning, There are links in all of these presentations. You can go there, you can find more information, and I think our panelists will be around a little while. You can probably ask them questions over the next day. So thank you, everybody. Please help me thank the panel.